Hey developer, in this section, we will now start learning how to create ReactJS components in different ways. So, to get us started, we will be using the following tools: Node.js, Yarn, and Create React App. Create React App is a powerful tool that lets us jump right in creating our web page using ReactJS instead of setting up everything from the scratch like Webpack, Babel, and etc. So, in this section, you will expect that you will know how components are being rendered and the different ways to show them in your UI. Rest assured that after you finish this section, you know all the different ways in creating components and how to debug them in case you encounter issues. So, I hope you're excited. I'll see you on the next lecture. Okay, so now let's set up our environment. For me, I'll be using Visual Studio Code as my preferred code editor, but you can use whichever you like, of course. But if you want to use the same thing, then just go to codevisualstudio.com and then click download. Okay? And then next, to set up our environment, I'll be downloading Node.js as well. So this one. So just click the latest LTS version. Even though your version is different from mine, that's totally fine. Just click download. And then once that's done, click install. Okay? So if you click this, and then click next, and then for me, I'm actually done installing this. So I'll just click cancel for now. Alright? But for you, just click next and then click install. Nothing complicated on it. Just click next, 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 and then install. Okay? And then next, we will also download Yarn. So Yarn will be the one that we will be using to download libraries like ReactJS, so we can use it in our application. So to do so, go back to your Visual Studio Code, open the terminal, so view, and then terminal. And then to install it, we can do npm install -- global and then Yarn. This is to install globally on your machine. So you can use Yarn in anywhere in your machine. Okay? So click enter. And then let's just wait a bit. So it's actually done on my end. So next, we will be using Create React App to get us started working with ReactJS. So in here, let's search for Create React App Typescript. Because aside from ReactJS, we will also be using TypeScript. Click the first one, and then copy this, and then open your Visual Studio Code again, paste it, and then before I do this, so let me just go to my documents folder. I want this to be the root folder, so I can install the Create React App project, and then it will be shown here. Okay? So select folder, and then paste the command here again. And then the my-app, this is actually the name of the project. So let me just change this to React Tutorial. And then click enter. So let's just wait a bit. Okay, so it is now done on my end. As you can see, I have this React tutorial in here. So let me just go to that project, open folder, documents, and then React tutorial, and then open it. Alright. So the main entry point for a Create React App application is actually on the source and then index.tsx. So as you can see here, we have the React DOM.create root, which contains the root element that we have in here. So this root element actually exists on the HTML page that is being used by the Create React App, which you can find on the public and then index.html. You can find it here. Okay? And then we are also rendering the components to that root element in the root.render. And then we have this app, which is our app component, which is actually this. So if we do yarn start, we should be able to run this project. And it's actually loading now. Alright. We now have this beautiful React application built using Create React App. And the good thing with this is if you check our project, so it is now use app.tsx, meaning this actually using TypeScript plus JSX. That's why in our code, in our JavaScript code, we can actually have these HTML elements to be added in our JavaScript code. So like this, these are called JSX. And then if you check your index.tsx, you can see as HTML element, meaning it is actually using TypeScript and adding some type to the return of this get element by ID root. Okay? So if we try to update this, for example, hello React, save it, and then if you view your project again or your website, as you can see, it actually updates automatically without even reloading the page. That process is actually called hot reloading. And Create React App already configures all those necessary configurations that we need to do all of those. So if we check our package.json and then check the scripts, so this is the first one that we have used to run our application, yarn start. And then next, we have this build, which you can actually run using yarn build. So let me just try to run it. So this will build your project in production mode. And then we have tests. So we can do yarn tests to run some unit tests in our project if there's any. For now, we have this app.test.tsx. So it's actually passed. Good. And then eject. So for this one, you should not be using this unless you want to fully customize how the Webpack bubble are actually configured. Also, just a reminder, if you do this, you can never go back. So for us, we don't really need to customize how Webpack and bubble are configured in React scripts. Everything looks good. Everything looks great for our project. So just ignore this one. And then next, so for now, let's just clean up our project. Let's remove this. We don't really need this actually. Even the app.css. Let's just delete the file. Okay. And then remove it in the import. So that's how you import the CSS in your JavaScript. Just do import./app.css. Normally, this is not possible, but with the help of Webpack, it is actually possible. So when you do yarn build, so we did a while ago, if you check your build, static, and then you can find the CSS in here. So basically, Webpack extracts all the CSS from your JavaScript codes and then put it in a main.css file. Okay? So that's the power of Webpack. Again, it's running behind the scene or in the background using Create React App. So we don't need to configure anything. Alright? And then also for our project, let's just add components. In here, a components folder. And for the unit test, we can also remove this as well. And even the logo. We don't need the logo as well. And then let's just add an h1 hello world in here just to make sure that our app is still running. Remove the class name, yarn start again, and let's check. Alright, it still works. Okay, so that's it for our setup. I hope you're excited to learn ReactJS. I know you do. So I'll see you on the next lecture. Okay, so let's now start creating our first component and how to use props in React. But first, let me just discuss how our components are being rendered in our page. Alright, so we have this React DOM.createRoot, meaning it's like it's saying that this element will be the root element of our React application. So meaning, this element, so this is where our components will be appended. And then in here, the root.render, it's just mean that this component will be actually rendered inside this root element. Okay, so let's do a yarn start just to see it in action. Don't worry, We will be discussing more about React DOM later. We have a separate section to discuss all of this. But for now, that's just an overview on how it works. So, if we check our application and then inspect the element, as you can see, we have this div id root, which is our root element, and then we have our app.tsx or app component. Okay? So, that's how our components are being rendered in our HTML page. Alright? So, another thing is, we have this React.streak mode. So, this is actually a built-in component coming from React. So, basically, this lets you find common bugs in your components early during development by running or doing extra things in your components. Alright? So, sometimes it will be going to render components twice or render your hooks twice. So, yeah, those kinds of things so you can catch bugs early during your development phase. Okay? So now, let's view our app.tsx. So again, as you can see, the HTML elements are actually all in lowercase, right? So div, h1, so the same thing on how you render HTML elements. They are all in lowercase. And then in here, we have our app.tsx, which is our component. And as you can see, it is being rendered with a capital letter on the first character. Alright? So, this pattern is something that you should follow because this is how JSX knows if your element is actually an HTML element or it is a React element. Okay? So, if you do it like this, small letter, you will actually have an error. So, app does not exist on type JSX.intrinsic elements because app is actually not an HTML element. So, when rendering components, it should be in capital letter. Alright? So, like this. Okay. So, now, let's create our first component. So, in the components, and then the button. So, I have a button folder in here. Let's just add index.tsx. And then in here, let's create our first component. So, export cons, button. And then this will be a functional component. And then this will return button. So, HTML element, lowercase. And then let's just add a click me. Alright. Let's see our page. Okay. So, it doesn't appear on our page. Why? Well, because we haven't actually added this in our app.tsx. Alright, so in here, let's do button. So like this, we don't want to add any children on it. And then import it. And then save it. And then, yeah. Now we have our first component, which is our button component. So if we inspect element, then this is the button click me that we have created in our button component, right? So, if you click this, well, nothing happens. So, why don't we add an on-click event? So, for the for normal HTML element, the on-click is actually in lowercase, but in React, it should be in a camel case. So, like this. Okay? As you can see, we have a helper because we are using TypeScript, and you can assure that you are writing the correct case. Okay? So, let's just add a function first. So, const handle click. And then, let's use this function in the on-click event of our button. So, to add a code, a variable, or a function to your JSX element, you should use curly brace. So, like this. Right? Just use a curly brace. And then pass the function in here. And then let's add console.log click. Let's see our page again. If we click this, alright, so we can see in the console, it's actually logging click. And of course, one thing that you need to remember is when creating a component, you should always have one parent element. You cannot create multiple elements on the same level. What I mean by that? So, like this, for example. So, as you can see, it's actually throwing an error. So yeah, you cannot do this. So what if you want to create multiple elements in here? Well, you should add a parent element. So one parent element and then add those two elements inside of it. So once you save it, check it again. So we have two elements in here, right? But of course, there are cases that, yeah, I want to remember two buttons, but the problem is I don't want to create an extra element as a parent element, right? Because it's just feels like it is actually incorrect. What if I want to render multiple elements, but I don't want to create a parent element, right? So that's where we will be using React.fragments. Alright? So in here, let's change the div React.fragment. And then let's import React. That's why it's actually having some errors there. React from React. Alright? And then, if we check again, click me, still being rendered. But if we check the HTML, then we don't have that extra div anymore. Right? So, you will be using React.fragment if you want to render multiple components but you don't want to add an extra parent element on it. So, aside from using React.fragment, you can also use the shortcut like this. So, this is also equal to React.fragment. So, if we check again, it's the same result. Next is, let's discuss about props. Well, props is like an attributes of elements because as you can see, when we're rendering our components, for example, button, it's just the same with HTML elements, right? The only difference is we actually have a capital letter for the button. Alright? So we can also pass attributes in here, or in React, we are calling it props. Okay? So what if you want to change the text in here, right? So to do that, what we can do is, we can first add a type for our React component. So we can do react.fc, meaning this is actually a functional component, meaning this component is built using functions. And then, to tell React what props we can pass in this button component, we can actually create an interface. Alright? Basically, an interface is like a declaring the types for an object. So props is also an object in React. So we'll be creating an interface, iButton props. And then in here, we can pass a children. And then we can use the type React node. So meaning, React node can actually be a string, number, boolean, and it can even be a React element. Okay? So, something that is the same like a children for an HTML element. So, let's use these props in the component. So, to use iButton props in our component, React.fc actually accepts one generic, which is the props of your component. Generic meaning you can pass any types in the React.fc. Okay? So now, when we do children in here, so we can use the structuring to get the props. So if we don't have the children in here, there will be an error because it doesn't know where the children is coming from. So if we add the children, as you can see, it's now not throwing any error. And then we will be passing it in here. Okay. And then let's remove the other one. There's an error in app.tsx. Why? Because we actually make the children required in our button props, right? To make it optional, you can add question mark. So there's no error anymore. But we don't really like to make it optional because we want the user of this component to always pass a children. Okay? So in here, what we can do is change this to button like this, and then we can pass click me and then save it. If we check again our page, so we have the click me button again, right? So if we click, then it's logging. still. Okay? How about if we want to pass the handle click? Of course, when creating a reusable button component, you want to make sure that whatever the user wants when you click the button is what will happen, right? So let's make this as a parameter. So to do that, we will declare handle click in here as a function that will return void and call it in here, and then that's it. And then in here, let's do on click, handle click, sorry. Maybe let's change this to on click, right? Because that's the same thing we are passing on the button component, right? So on click, and then in here, let's say console.log reusable handle click. Save it, and then in our page, and then click it, reusable handle click. Alright, so we were able to create a reusable button component, although currently it's very ugly, I know, but the good thing is we understand how we can render components, how we can create components, how we can use React fragments as well, and how we can pass props in our component and using TypeScript as well. Currently, we are using interface. Again, interface is used to add types for objects, and props are actually objects in React. Okay? One more thing that I want to show you is you can also use isValid element. Okay? So in here, let's do console.log isValid element. isValid element. Alright, let me just remove the colon and then import this from React in here. And then let's pass the button. Sorry, not like that. Let's just copy this. Or maybe let's just pass a simple one actually. Maybe something like P. Okay? And then let's check our page. And then refresh. So is valid element true? So this actually a function that we can use to check if an element is actually a valid React element. Alright? Something that you should know, especially if you want to check if an element or if a component is actually a valid React element, and then you can do something if that's the case. Alright? Something that you should take note as well. And as you can see in here, when we refresh the page, we are rendering it twice. Why? Because strict mode, this actually renders our component twice. Why? Because in React, we should make sure that our components are pure. Meaning, same input should produce same output to avoid an entire class of baffling bugs and unpredictable behavior as your code base grows. Because if you pass the same props, for example, but it produces a different result, that's kinda hard to track how it happens. Making your components pure would make life easier. Easy debugging means easy life. Right? So, if we try to remove this, just so I can show you that I'm saying the truth, and then refresh this again, so we are now just seeing is valid element once. Oh, I have a wrong spelling. Apologies for that. So it's valid element. So yeah, it's rendering once. But if we've added strict mode again, then we will be rendering it twice again. Right? Okay, so that's the basic on how you can create components and how you can pass props to your components as well. And I hope you like this lecture, and I'll see you on the next one. So now we know how to create components and how to render them in our page. I think it is time to create or add some styling on our reusable button component, right? So still in our app.tsx, we have the hello world, our reusable button, which you can pass the on click and the children on it. So going to the button component in here. So we have the button, a button, and then the on-click handler or the props that we are passing in here, and the children. And we have the interface again to specify what props we can pass to our button component. Okay? So now, let's try to add another props, which is the type. Okay? Maybe let's add a primary or default. Right? So we can have a primary button or a default button. Okay? So this can be optional. And then we can get the type in here. Let me just enter this one so you can see it clearly. And like this. Okay? So, how can we add CSS or styles in our component? So in here, what we can do is we can actually pass a style. Alright? So the same with on how we are doing it on HTML elements. So we can add some object in here. Like for example, we can change the background color. So one thing to note is it is still on camel case. So we can add blue. And then the font color, let me just enter this so you can see it clearly. Okay, so let's add color and then white. Oops, white. Okay, just a simple one, of course. And then if we see it, so we have this button, right? So it has a background color of blue and then color white. So a simple one. So there is one way on how you can update the CSS or the style of your element, or you can add a class on it. Okay, so in here, in the button folder, let's add one more file, index.css. Then in here, let's create btn primary. Let's just copy this. So background color blue and color white. Background color blue and then color white. So if we have a primary button, we will be having this CSS in here. And then instead of passing a style, we can actually pass a class. So how do we pass a class in React element? So we can do class name and then btn-primary. Let's see again. Oops, it's still not working. Why? Because we haven't imported our CSS in our button component. Okay? So to do that, we can do import and then that slash index.css and then that should work. Alright, so we now have a blue background color and a white color for our primary button. Okay, so how can we calculate the type so that if type is actually primary, then we will be using the button primary, and if it's default, then we will not be using any CSS on it. So the simple way to do it is cons and then class name and then type is equals to primary. If that's true, then we will be passing button primary, else nothing on it. Okay, and then class name and then make this a code, pass the variable in here and then save and then here. So yeah, so why it turns to the default one? Because we need to pass the type in here. Type equals primary. Save it and then yeah, it's now again our primary button. And then let's render one more, a default one. So default, save it and then yeah. Okay, so that's how you can use style and class names for our React elements. Okay, and also in here, when using style, something that you need to take note is, for example, we pass a height in here. Oops, height, and then you pass 20, for example. Save it and then save. Then when you inspect the element style, as you can see in here, there's an automatic adjustment on the 20 that you pass on the height. It becomes in px right away. Okay? So when you pass 20 or 100, it is being converted automatically to pixels. Alright? Something that you need to take note when you're passing a numeric value for the height using the style props in your button element. And yeah, that's actually it for adding styles to your components. I hope you like this lecture, and I'll see you on the next one. Okay, so let's now discuss lists and keys. So list only means that you can actually render multiple elements inside an array in your component. For example, we have these inputs that contains an array of JSX elements or elements. So in here, we have the first element or the first value of an array, which is the div, and it has input on it. And then second one, and then just by calling inputs in here, I can actually render two inputs in just one variable. Okay? So if I look in here, we have two inputs now, so 1 and 2. Okay? But there's a warning, list should have a unique key prop. Okay? So something to take note, when rendering lists, we should use or add a key prop, and it should be unique. So for example, we add key 1, and then we add key 1 as well, and refresh. So we will be having an issue that the two children is actually having the same key. Why? Because React doesn't know which element is which, because they have the same identity. So if we change it to 2, then that should work, right? And also with keys, this actually helps React when doing the rendering of your component. Because if there's a unique key in your element, for example, we have 1 and 2, and for example, the second input has been changed to have a value of 2 minus 1, then React knows that we only need to update the second element or the second input. But if you don't have a key, then what React will do is it will actually traverse all the siblings element in here to see which element is equals to that element and then do the updates. But if there's a key, then React can just check for the key and then update element with the same key. Okay? And also, something to take note that key should only be unique with its adjacent elements or its siblings. So, to show you that, in here, let's add div and then input key 1, and it should be unique to its siblings or adjacent elements. So it's going to be 2. Add one more. So they have the same key, but they are on the different parent element, right? If we save this, refresh, there will be no warnings or errors. Why? Because keys should only be unique to its siblings or adjacent elements. Okay? Next, I want to show you the importance of using keys in the list. Well, I think I did really show you the importance of it, but let's check this keys component. Okay? Let's render this in here. Okay, save it. And then the component is actually just a very basic one. So we actually have a list of fruits. So in here, we have an array of fruits. So currently, we are using useState hook in here. But later, we will have a separate lecture for useState hooks. But for now, just keep in mind that this useState hook is actually containing an array of fruits. And then these values are being saved in the fruits variable. And to update the fruits, we can actually use the setFruits function. And when you call setFruits from the useState, it will actually do a render of your component. And then in here, based on the fruits, we are going to create some elements. So we will have apple and coconut, and we will have input element on it. And then the inputs will be rendered in our component. And we just have a button that will let us add a mango on our list of fruits. Okay, just a very basic one. So if we click add mango, it will be added at the end of the list of our fruits with an input element on it. Let me refresh this again. So 1, 2, add mango, and then 3. So everything works fine, right? Let's just add a key so we don't get this warning. One thing to take note is if we don't pass a key, what React uses is actually the index of the element. So for example, if we don't pass an index or a key in here, then the first item will have an index of 1, the second item will have an index of 2, and then 3. Okay? So it is the same thing as adding key, index. Okay? Refresh this again. Alright. So we have apple, coconut, and then if we click add mango, and if you check the console, there's no error anymore. Okay? And also, when you add a key, it doesn't appear on the DOM of your page. Okay? Something to take note as well. So now, since we're adding mango at the last, what if we actually want to add it at the first, as the first item of our array? Okay, let's save it and then refresh this. Let's add a value in our input element for apple and then coconut. Click add mango. Alright, what happened? So when we add mango as the first item in our array, the apple input has been added to it. And then the coconut has been used in the apple. And then the coconut has the empty input box now. So, what did actually happen? That's the problem when we are going to use index as a key. Why? Because first, what happened is we render the apple with the key of 1, and then the value is the apple, and then div2, key 2, and the coconut with the value of coconut. So, when we add the mango at the last part, we just added the key of 3, and then mango, and then mango. Alright, very simple. But if we add the mango as the first item, what will happen is, it will become like this. Let me just remove this asterisk. And then the key 1 will be used on the mango, key 2 on the apple, key 3 on the coconut. And then since the key 1 is actually using the input value apple, then this will be used in the mango since the key 1 now is being used by the mango. And then the key 2 before was from the coconut, so the input will be used on the coconut, but the span is now apple. And then since key 3 is a new one and we don't have an input on key 3 because it is a new element, then there will be no value in here. Okay? So that's the problem if we are going to use index, because what if the new element has been added as the first item and it will have the index 1? Then the previous render, like for this example, the apple, which has the key 1 before, will be used in the key 1 with the mango and using the wrong value for the input. Okay? So, to make this unique, instead of using index, since our list of fruits are actually unique, we can then use value as the key. So, if we refresh the page, apple, coconut, and then click add mango, and then it works. Because apple is for apple, coconut is for coconut, and mango is for mango. So that's the importance of making your key unique in the list, so you don't encounter this kind of issues. Alright, that's it for the list and keys. I hope you like it, and I'll see you on the next one. Okay, so now let's discuss conditional rendering in ReactJS. So, we have a simple component, again, app.tsx, that contains an h1 with the header of false book, and we have a post component. For the post component, it is also a simple component wherein we have a span, my post, and we are showing the date as well. So, if we check the web page, it is just a simple UI. So, we have false book, my post, and the date today. Okay? So what if I only want to show the date for certain conditions? So we can actually add a prop in here. So interface, I post props. Let's add show date, which is going to be a boolean, of course. And then we only want to show the date if the show date is actually true. Okay? So the first way to do this is we can have an if condition. But first, let's add our props in here and then get the show date. If show date is true, then we will be returning this. Else, if it's false, then we will remove the date in here. Okay? So in our app.tsx, let's add show date. Okay? Actually, for booleans, even though you don't add a true value here, once you added the show date props, meaning it will default to true. Okay? So if we check our web page, we will see the date again. Okay? But if we change to false, like this, then it will not be visible anymore. Okay? So we are using if condition to do our conditional rendering. Another way to do this is we can actually use the ampersand, the double ampersand. Okay? So in here, let's remove this. And in here, what we can do is we can have show date, double ampersand, and then date. So the same with how JavaScript really works. So if we save this, it's not showing. But if we change this to true, so it's showing again. Okay? Or another way to do it is you can also create a list like what we have learned before. So cons render comp, and then we have a list. So first we will add our post, and then if show date equals true, we can have render comp that push, and then let's pass the date in here. Oops, sorry. Should be like this, and we can do render comp in here. Okay, let's see. Alright, so we can still see our date. And if we change to false, so it's not appearing here. But since we made it as a list, then we need to add a unique key prop, as always. Okay? But usually, you should only use double ampersand, not the list or the if condition, because that's easier to read. So if we undo the changes, so like this, so this is the better way, so it's readable actually. So render this again, it's not showing, and true, it's going to show again. Okay, so that's actually it for conditional rendering. I hope you like it, and I'll see you on the next one. Now, let's talk about the life cycle of components. So, there's actually 3 that you only need to remember. Very easy, right? So, when the component mounts, when the component updates, and when the component unmounts. So, a component mounts is when it's added to the screen. So, when you can see your UI or your component on the screen. Then, a component updates is when it receives a new props or state, usually in response to an interaction. Sometimes I call this re-renders, so please don't be confused with that. They are just the same thing. And lastly, a component unmounts when it's removed from the screen or in the DOM. So let me show you how it works. So in our application, we have app.tsx that contains my component, and inside my component, this actually accepts a props, a counter props, and inside of it, we have a child component. So if the counter is less than 5, then we will render child component. Okay? So inside child component, we only have a div child component, and we also have a console.log just to know if the components or if the child component has been rendered or not. Same thing with my component. Okay? So let's check the web page and refresh this. So we have counter 1. This is our my component. Maybe I'll just add a h1 in here again. Maybe like this. So my component. And then let's add the counter as a paragraph. So like this. And like this. Okay? So we can easily see that we have the my component and we have the child component. Okay? So now, if we check the console and refresh the page, so we will have or we will see that we have my component render and child component render. Why? Because we actually render our my component and child component. That's why these codes in here will be executed. So we will get console.log my component render and console.log child component render. So this is the initial mount of our component, and this is the lifecycle event when component mounts, when you can see your UI or component for the first time in the DOM or in the screen, whichever you want to call it. Okay? How about the component updates? So let's use our React Dev Tools, components, and in here we have my component. So if I change the counter to 2 and then click outside, you will see here that we have a new my component render and child component render. Why? Because we actually update the value of our props, and React knows that it needs to render again our my component. So when we render the my component, we are also going to render the child component. So my component execute all of the codes inside the my component function, and child component executes all the codes inside the child component function. That's why we have received my component render and child component render again in our log. Okay? How about when component unmounts? So, as you can remember, we have this counter in here, counter less than or equals to 5, then we will actually show the child component. If it's 6 or more than 6, then it will be removed from our DOM, or we will not show it. Okay? So in here, in my component, we have this counter. Let's change it to 6. And then watch the console. Okay? So for the console, it only adds my component render. Why? So the component updates again or renders again because we have updated the props, which is the counter, to become 6. Alright? But as you can see, we don't have the child component render anymore. Why? Because the child component was not re-rendered or was not updated. It has been removed in our DOM. So this code in here were not executed. So these are the life cycles of a component. It is very important that you know this so that you know what events can happen in your component. You can also use this as a guide when we start learning React hooks later in this course. Once you understand this, learning React hooks is going to be very easy. Okay? I hope you like this lecture about life cycle of a component. There's only 3, so please remember all of them and how they works, and I'll see you on the next lecture. So, at a glance, we definitely want to know what are the components being rendered in our page, what are the props being passed to them, what is the state or even hooks attached to it. This will be very helpful in debugging in case you encounter issues. Even when doing performance optimizations to your page, you want to see which component is taking some time to render. So, how do we do it? If we do inspect element and see it here, so it is not possible to see those things as we are just seeing plain HTML element on it. So, how can we check that? So now, we will be using React Dev Tools. So in here, it is a Chrome extension built by React. So let's download this one. Click Add to Chrome, Add Extension, and let's just wait a bit. Alright, it's now added to my Chrome extension. So in here, I'll pin this one so we can easily see it. And if I go back here, and then, okay, let's refresh the page. Alright, so it's now activated or enabled. So with this one, let me just close this developer tools again and do inspect element. Okay, so we now have components and profiler. So these two are actually coming from the React DevTools Chrome extension that we have downloaded. Okay? So if we go to components, we can actually see all the components being rendered in our page. So we have app. So in here, so we have app.tsx component. And then we also have post to post component, which is this one, this post component, meaning I'm doing or I am rendering two post component currently in my web page. Okay? So if you click the app, you can also see the props that are being passed to it, the hooks attached to it. So currently I have two use state hooks attached to my app, and the rendered by. So if it's rendered by create root or by React DOM. So React DOM meaning the create root is actually coming from the React DOM library. Okay? And also the source. So it is on index.tsx12. Okay? So if we check index.tsx12, and here it is, the app component. Right? If we check the post, so it's on app.tsx18. And here it is. Alright? Very, very useful. So, how about let's try to add a post. So in here, if I add Google, for example, and then click save, so it's being added in here, as well as in our components. Right? So as you can see, we have this text, Google, show date true. I can also update the props in this components tab. So if I do false and then enter, so as you can see, I don't have the date anymore on my post. But if I change it to true again, okay, so now you can see the date again. You can even text or you can even change the text. So Google's, for example. So yeah, very, very helpful, right? So you can actually control what are the props being passed in your component, which we can use for your investigation in case you have some issues or concerns found in your application. Right? Even the state, actually, you can also modify them. So in the app, so I have this to use state in here. So I can change this to, for example, Facebook. This state actually is attached to our input component. So as you can see, we have Facebook here now. If I change it to Facebooks with S, so it's now changed to Facebooks. And then click save. So I have a new post, Facebooks, and this first state is actually the list of our posts. So I can also modify this. So open this one, new entry, let's add Amazon, enter, and yeah, I was able to add a new post, Amazon. Okay, so very, very handy. You can actually change everything in here, the props, the state, and you can see which components render it, which functions render it, and where it has been rendered. Next one is, we can also check the profiler. This is actually something that we will talk about in the later lecture of this course. But basically, you can use this to profile your application to measure how much React took to render your component. For now, just focus on the components part of the React Dev Tools. Okay? So that's actually it for this React Dev Tools. So as you can see, this is a very powerful tool to make sure that your app is working as expected and to make sure that your app is actually running in an optimized way. If not, then you know where to look at. Right? So I hope you like this lecture and I'll see you on the next one. Okay, so now let's discuss use state hook. So, what is actually a state and why do we need to use it? State is basically a component-specific memory or like a snapshot that you can use to remember what state you are in. For example, you need to show a modal or you need to show that your counter variable is 5, like this one, and when you click increment, it will become 6 and show it to the user and so on and so forth. So meaning, you don't want just to update your variable that holds the value of counter when clicking this increment button, but you want to update the UI to show that value as well to the user. So any user interactions that we need to remember so we can show something to the user, state can help with that. Let's start right away so you can understand this better. So first, I have this UI. So we have a header counter 5 and increment button. Currently, nothing happens. Okay? So if we go to our code, and let's go first to index.tsx. Let's just remove react.strict mode for now because this actually is doing an extra stuff on our components and hooks. So I don't want you to get confused on how the useState hook works. So we will remove it for now. And then in app.tsx, let's view our component. So in here, we have the counter component. So what I have here is I have this variable counter equals 5. And then I have this UI that shows the value of the counter. As you can see, nothing or no functionality in my button component currently. Okay? So we will now use useState so that when we click the button increment, we will update the value of our counter and show it to the user. So this should become 6. Okay? So let's call useState. So useState. So coming from React. Okay? And this will accept a parameter which is the initial value of your state. So for now, let's make it 5 to be consistent with our counter variable. And then this will actually return an array. And that array contains the state that holds the value and the function to update the state. So we will use array destructuring. So like this. So the first item is the value of the state, which is counter. And then we have the function to update the state, which is going to be set counter. Okay? So the value initially of the counter will be 5. So let's now remove this. And then let's add an onClick to our button. So in here, let me just create a function, const handle click. This is going to be used by our button. So onClick in here, pass the handle click. And in here, let's do set counter, then counter plus 1. So this accepts a parameter of the new value of your state. Okay? Let's save it. Check our UI again. And if I click increment, okay, so it's now becoming 6 up to 12, right? So that's the power of useState. Now, what if I tried to do it like this? By the way, let me just add a console.log first. Console.log render. So we know if we are rendering our component or not. Click increment again. Let me just refresh the page. Let's go back to 5, the default one. Click increment. So as you can see, even though I haven't clicked increment, it calls render. Why? Because our component renders or mounted for the first time. So if I click increment again, it's now going to add one more. So basically, when you update your value or the value of your counter, it is also rendering your UI in here. Okay? Also, just to clarify, when I say render, it means that React will run the code inside your functional component again. All of this code that you can see in here. React is just smart enough that when you just render, useState will not reinitialize the value of your state to the default value again, which is 5 in our current example. So remember that when the component re-renders, the whole function, all of it, are being executed again. And when using useState, we are always having or using the new value of counter in every render. UseStateHook is also smart enough that when you pass the same value, React will not re-render as it is just doesn't make sense anyway, right? So let's try it. Let's remove one in here, save it, and in here, if I click increment, so console, remove the render log, and click increment, so actually it's not re-rendering. Why? Because we are just passing the same value in here. So React, specifically UseStateHook, is smart enough to detect that we are just using the same value. So it doesn't make sense to re-render. Okay? Another one is to add types for your useState. You can actually use generics like this. So in here, we want it to be number. So like that. So you can actually pass here what type will be used for your state. If you don't pass one, then it will try to detect what type you have passed, and in our case, it is just a number. Okay? So currently, it's a number, but if you remove this, React will detect it. So if you check counter again, it is still type number. So for now, I'll just remove it since it's just a simple example anyway, and React can detect that what we are passing is actually type number. So now, what if I add one more? So I have two set counter. Okay? So, can you guess what will be the output? Let's test it out. So refresh the page and then click increment. Let me just remove this so it will not be confusing. Click increment. Okay, so we only have one render and we only update the counter just one, even though we are passing or calling set counter twice and adding counter plus one in here. Right? So why? Well, what's actually happening is when you use useState and call the set counter function, React actually batches all the set counter state that you are using. So these two will be batched. That's why the current value of counter is 5. So 5 plus 1, 6. And then in here, 5 plus 1, 6. And then React will actually merge the result and just do one re-render for your component. That's why we only have one re-render in here or one render in our log. Okay? But what if we do plus 2 in here? Let's see the output. So refresh again. Increment, still 6. Why? Because it actually uses the last update of the set counter. So if we change this to 1, so I can prove it to you that it is actually using the last value of the set counter or the last call of the set counter. Save it, refresh, increment, it's now 7, right? And just one re-render. Okay? Because it is actually using the last value that you have used when calling set counter. Now, what I want to show you is what if, so we do it like this. Let's add a set timeout in here. So, and then let's add 500 milliseconds. So basically, what set timeout does is it will just delay the execution of what's inside this set timeout. And let's do alert. Let's alert the value of counter and then save it. So when I click increment again, what do you think will be the value of our counter in the alert? Okay, let's see. So increment, it becomes 6, but the set timeout only returns 5. Why? Because the counter in here is actually referencing the counter variable from the previous render. So it is not referencing the counter when we have re-rendered the component because of a set counter update. Okay? So this one references the counter or the previous counter, which is the value of 5, and not the re-render one, which is 6. Okay? So something to take note about. So let's now remove set timeout. So now, what if I really want to do a to call for my set counter, right? And I want it that when it's currently 5, 5 plus 1 is 6, and then another one is 6 plus 1 equals 7. So I want that when I click handle click, this is going to be 7. The value of our counter will be 7. So how can we do that? So this set counter function in here can also accept a function like this, and you just need to return the value that you want to use for the update. And also, the first parameter is actually the value or the previous value of your counter. Okay? So in here, counter plus 1, something like that. So let's try it out first. Let's remove this one, comment this one, save, and then okay, refresh, click increment. So it becomes 6, right? So it is using the previous value, which is 5, and then add 1 on it. But what if I have this another call in here? Okay, let's see what will be the output. Let's clear this one, refresh, clear this again, just so you won't be confused, as we want to check how many times it will render. Click increment. So we only render once, and we have 7. Why? Because these two set counter in here have been batched again and executed both of them before we do a re-render. So what happened here is this set counter actually uses the previous value of the counter, which is 5, and then 5 plus 1 equals 6, and then this another one uses the previous value of counter, which is now 6, and then 6 plus 1 equals 7. That's why we only have one re-render, and the value of counter is actually 7. So the next thing that I want to show you is, in here, this use state can't just hold a primitive value, but it can also accept a function call on here. So if you have a function to produce the value of your initial state, then you can actually pass it in our use state. So in here, let's have const calculate counter. Let's just return 5, actually. And then let's pass it in here. And save it. And then check. So we still have 5. Let's just add a console.log in here, just to make sure that we are actually calling this. Refresh. As you can see, we have calculate counter and then render. So why do you think we want to do this? Why? Because if in case your calculation in here is actually expensive, so instead of doing this, you can just pass the function instead. Because in every render, this function will be called if we do it like this. So let's see this in action. Save it, and then refresh this one. If I click increment, as you can see, calculate counter is always being called, right? So what if this calculate counter function is actually very expensive? So it's like taking 500 milliseconds before it returns the value of your counter. Then, in every render, you need to wait for 500 milliseconds, right? But if we pass this as a function reference in here, and then save it, refresh the page, initial render, we have called calculate counter. If we click increment, we are not calling the calculate counter anymore. Okay? So if you have a function to calculate the initial value of your state, you can actually pass that function in here instead of calling it like this to prevent another call for that function. Especially if this is an expensive or a function that would slow down the render of your component. Okay? So that's it for now for use state, and we will learn more in the next lecture. So the next thing that I want to show you is, so in app.tsx, I actually have another component, which is the fruits component. Let's just view the fruits component. Well, nothing much in here actually, so we just have an h1 fruits input button to add mango and a UI to show the fruits. Okay? So if we check our UI, it is like this. Let me just add again a console.log in here for the re-rendering. Save it. Refresh this. So render once, of course, initial mount of our component. And we have this fruits in here. And when we click add mango, it should add mango in here. Actually, we don't need the input in here. Let me just remove it. So it is just a basic example. So when we click add mango, we should be able to add a fruits in here. So how do we do that? Again, very simple. Use state. We will be using use state. Cons use state. The initial value of our state will be this array for our fruits. Let me just import this one from React. and remove this. We now have fruits and set fruits. Okay? Save it. And yeah, we still have the same output. So now, if I click add mango, I should be able to add a mango in here. So, add another function in here for our button click. Const handle click. And then, let's do set fruits. And then, fruits that push. And then, mango. And this one, on click. Okay, actually not like this. Alright, like this. And pass the fruits. Okay? Alright, so let's see what will happen. Refresh the page. Click add mango. Oops, nothing actually happens. So if we click our components just to view the fruits, so we actually have a mango in our state, but we don't show it in here. Why? Because we did it the wrong way. Why? Because we just did a fruits that push to add mango on the array and then call set fruits using the fruits variable. As we know, objects are actually reference types. So this fruits in here is actually the same with the previous fruits from our previous render. So even if we push a lot more in here, we are just referencing the same memory. Okay? So how can we make sure that the state or our component will actually update once we update our array? So what we can do in here is, we can actually use spread operator to create a shallow copy of fruits and then add mango as the last item of our array. So now, our array is a new array that references a new memory but still contains the fruits of the previous render with a new one, which is the mango. So, if you refresh this page, click add mango, and we now have the mango in here, even in our state. Okay? So, something to take note of, that objects are reference type, so you need to take note or you need to be careful on how you update your state using objects and arrays. One more thing that I want to show you is, and something that you should avoid is, let's go to app.tsx. Let's use counter again, as this is a simpler one. So save. So go to our web page. So increment. Okay, so we're using +2. So don't ever do this way of using set counter. So let's add set counter outside the handle click. Okay, let's remove this, this one, and then in here let's just do counter +1. So don't ever do this. Why? Because in every render we are calling set counter, which means it will trigger another render and so on and so forth. It will be an unlimited loop. Okay, let me show you. So if we go back here, refresh this, then there is an error. Too many renders. React limits the number of renders to prevent an infinite loop. Okay? So don't ever do this. One more thing is, let's go to, let's just undo this. Let's just undo and all good. Let's just do it like this and then counter +1 in here. And let's go back to index.tsx. And in here, let's bring back strict mode. So like this, let's put it inside the strict mode to wrap it. So we can use strict mode there. And in here, okay? So if we go here, clean it, refresh the page. So as you can see, it is actually calling our calculate counter twice. Okay? And even the component is being rendered twice. As you can see in here, there is what we called install hook.js. So this is actually coming from react.strict mode. So react.strict mode actually renders your component twice and call your initial state function for useState twice. Why? This is to make sure that this function, this functional component of yours, and this initial state function are all pure. Pure meaning if we pass the same props or the same state, we will have the same output. Even the same with the calculate counter function as the initial state. When we call this twice, it should return the same output on the same parameters. Okay? So that's what the strict mode is doing. So that's the usage of React.strict mode, so you can detect impurities to your component and to your initial state function. So that's actually it for our use state. I hope you like it and you have learned a lot, and I'll see you on the next one. So now, let's talk about controlled and uncontrolled components or elements. Either it is a component or element, they're just using the same pattern anyways. So in our app, we have app.tsx again with fruit search component inside it. And inside the fruit search component, we have this search and input element and an unordered list. So we are showing all the fruits that we have in a list. Okay? So if we check our UI, so we have this search input element and then apple, mango, coconut, and strawberry. Okay? So initially, when you render this input element in here, this is actually uncontrolled. Meaning, the user can input whatever values they want as the input element is actually managing its own state and show any values that the user inputs. So, if we try to add avocado in here, so we can actually do it freely, right? And also, we can actually use default value props if we want to add a default value for our input element. For example, avocado. Save it, and then refresh the page. So as you can see, we have avocado in here as a default value. But still, we can modify this however we want. So avocados, like for example, add an S and add any characters that you want. Alright? Just take note though that the default value props are only used on component mount or initial render of the component. So let me show you what I mean. So in here, let's add a state, a counter state again. So like this, let's just import this one from React. Okay, this one. And let's add a button, add counter or increment. And let's add a handle click function or on click. So just a simple one. And then counter plus 1. Okay, so basically we will just increment the counter again by 1 in every click. Okay, so if we refresh the page again and check the fruit search component, so in here, if we click increment counter, let me just update the input first. So let's do this as pineapple and click increment counter. As you can see, our hooks has been updated. So if I click another one, it becomes 3. So meaning it is actually rendering our component, but the input element doesn't change or reverting to its initial value. Why? Because default value is only the default value when the component or the input element mounts. So in every render, it will not revert to its initial value again. But of course, if you unmount the component and mount it again, it will reset to the default value, because remember that default value props will always be used on component mount. Okay? This is true for the other props with default prefix as well, like default check for a checkbox. So this one. Okay? So now, what's a controlled component or element? Controlled component means that you want to control the value being used by your component or element. Meaning, the component or element will not manage its own value. They are being controlled by the parent component. So here, if we pass a value props to an input element, so let's change this to a value like this. And then we can now remove this button counter in here. We don't need this anymore. Save it. And then we have avocado still, but if you type something, it will not reflect to the input element. So currently I'm typing but nothing happens, right? So we will also get a warning. You provided a value prop to a form field without an onChange handler, this will render a read-only field. Why? Because we are actually controlling the value of the input element, but we don't have a way to change the value of it. Meaning, we don't have a function to control the value. So now, let's add an onChange event to our input element. Okay? So in here, let's do cons, and then let's add input, set input equals to useState, then initial value is avocado. Okay? And in here, let's pass the input. And for the set input, let's do an onChange event. So in here, let's add an onChange event. Okay, so let's create a function, handle onChange, handle input onChange. So how about the type? So what I usually do is I just hover over the onChange and copy this type in here. So I can easily know what type I need to use for my function. So like this. So it's a hack that I'm using, and pass it in here. And this has an event as a first parameter. And what we can do is we can call set input and then pass the e.currentTarget.value. Okay, save it. So now, if we do press S, so as you can see, it is now updating. So we can do avocado and type it again. So now, we're controlling the value of the input element by using useState and pass the value of the state to our value props for the input element. So now, maybe you're wondering, why are you going to use this pattern of controlling the value of the element by using useState hook? Well, if you want to update the value of your input element as well as trigger a render so that your UI will be updated, then you definitely want to use this. So let me show you using the simple UI that we have here. Okay? So in here, I have apple, mango, coconut, and strawberry. So if I type A, it should show all the fruits that has A on it. And type P, so it should show all the fruits with AP on it. Okay? Very simple. So what we will do here is, let's now remove the default value in here. So this will be empty initially. I don't want any initial value for this. And then in here, we can do filter, and then fruit, and then what we will do is fruit that includes the input. So just a very basic example. So if the fruit value contains the text from the input element, then it will be shown in our UI. Okay? So save it. So now if I type A, so we have 3, type P, and we only have 1, which is the apple. Okay? So that's the case when you are going to use useState and controlled elements or components. It is when you want to update the value of your input element and you also want to trigger a render so that your UI will be updated. Like for example, in this fruit search component. Okay? So I hope you like this lecture about controlled and uncontrolled components. Again, uncontrolled component meaning the component or the input element is managing its own value or state. And we can also use default value if we want to show a default value for the input element, for example. And controlled component meaning the value of the element or the component is being managed by the parent component. So in this case, the value of input element is being managed by the fruit search component. I hope it's clear, and I hope you know when to use this useState plus controlled component combo. And I'll see you on the next lecture. So, let's start learning useRef hook. So, this is a React hook that lets you reference a value that's not needed for rendering. So, if you just want to store some data but don't want to trigger rendering, then you can actually use this. But what's the difference with normal variables? Right? So, let's see this in action. So currently, I have this counter component in my app component, And inside the counter component, still the basic example. So we have the counter value, showing it here, using useState so that when we click the handle click function, we will increase or increment the value of our counter. Okay? So in our UI, it looks like this. So if we click increment counter, the value is increasing, right? And when you use useState, again, it's actually going to trigger a re-render in your UI. Okay? So now, what if I want to use a normal variable to store another counter? Okay? So in here, let's do let normal counter equals to 0. Okay? And then when we click a button in here, it will increase. So let's add h3 normal counter, pass the value of normal counter. And then we have a button again for the button click, increment normal counter, and duplicate this as well, handle normal counter click. And in here, let's do plus normal counter. And also, let's log the value of this. Okay? So, like this. Save it and pass this on the on click in here. Save it. So, if I click increment normal counter, as you can see, it actually doesn't trigger a re-render. Why? Because it is just a normal variable, right? But when I click increment counter, it will trigger a re-render. Of course, the value will be 1 for our useState counter. But if you click increment normal counter again, if you click this, let's clear this, click normal counter, the value resets to 1. Right? Why? Because in every re-render of our component, it is actually going to execute all the codes in here. And what will happen is, normal counter will be reinitialized again to 0. Okay? So one more. Click this, 6, 7, click increment counter, click increment normal counter, it goes back to 1. Okay? So, that's the problem when using a normal variable. What if you want the data or the current data of the normal counter to persist in every render? So, with that, we can actually use useRef hook. So, in here, let's do cons and then ref counter equals to useRef, and then the first parameter is the initial value, so it will be 0. Okay, and then show it in here. Okay, ref counter, for the useRef. So to access the value of the useRef, you need to use ref counter dot current. Okay, so as you can see, the type of current is actually a number. And if you want to change the type of this, you can also pass a generic like this. So number. Okay? And then in here, what we can do is handle normal counter. Let's change this to ref counter. Ref counter. And in here, handle ref counter click. Okay? And ref counter counter.current is equals to ref counter.current plus 1. And we can now log in here. Okay? Save it. So, let's see this in action. Refresh the page. Increment ref counter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As you can see, also something to take note that when you change the value of your ref, it actually doesn't trigger a re-render. As you can see in here, it is still 0. Even though we're changing the value of the ref, it is still 0, right? Because it doesn't trigger a re-render. But when you click increment counter, so as you can see, the value becomes 9, right? So one more, refresh the page, increment ref counter, 5, click increment counter, this will trigger a re-render, click it, it becomes 5. Why? Because the latest value of our ref.current is actually 5. And when we trigger a re-render or click increment counter, this actually triggers a re-render to increase the value of our counter state to 1. And it's now going to use the latest value of our ref counter, which is 5. Okay? So that's how you can persist the value of your variable in every render. You are going to use useRef. Okay? So there's a lot of benefits when you can persist the value of your variable in every render. One example is when creating a stopwatch. Okay? So I have another component in here which is a stopwatch. Save it. So let's explore this stopwatch component. So in here I have this useState which has the time and then set time. And then in here I have the header time showing the number of time, and then on click to handle the start and the button to stop it. Currently, I don't have an implementation on the stop button. I only have on the start. So when we click start, we will use set interval and then do set time. So we will just increase the value of our time to +1. Okay? So it looks like this. If we click start, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then when we click stop, we should be able to stop this. Okay? So how can we do that? So how are we going to implement to stop the timer? So first, we need to use clear interval. So clear interval accepts the ID of this set interval. Okay? So we can have let timer, and then timer equals to set interval, and then in here, cons handle stop. We can do clear interval timer. Okay? So there's just an error on the type. Okay? It should be node.js.timeout. Let's do it like this. Okay. Save it. Alright, looks good. So let's assign this handle stop in here. Okay? So save it, and then let's run this again. Maybe let me do console.log timer in here. Okay. Refresh the page. Start. 1, 2, 3, 4. When I click stop, so the value of our timer is actually undefined. Why? Because it actually reinitializes in every render. When we call set timeout or set time in our use state, this actually triggers a render, hence make the timer undefined again, right? So how can we persist the value in every render? So we will be using useRef. So cons timer equals to useRef, and then value is null initially, and we can assign node.js timeout. Okay, so remove this. And we can now do timer.current. So again, to access the current value or to set the current value of a ref, you need to call current. So yeah, we just need to remove this null. So it can't be null. It can just be undefined. So timer.current, and then in here, timer.current, and then clear interval, timer.current. And then let's save it. So let's try again. Start. 2, 3, 4, 5, stop. As you can see, there's a value in our timer.current. So this is the ID of our set interval. That's why we were able to use clear interval to stop the set interval. So the timer stops, right? So that's one of the benefits on using useRef. Of course, there's a lot more, and you will encounter it while building a big application using ReactJS. Okay? I hope you like this lecture, and I'll see you on the next one. One thing that you want to do when creating an application is to select an element in the DOM, like this input element, right? So you can manipulate it programmatically. Sometimes you want to trigger a click or focus event, or even other events, right? Or sometimes you want to read the data from an input element, or even write data into it, right? So, what's the React way of doing this? Again, we are going to use useRef hook. Okay? So first, I just want to show you how vanilla JS developers will actually do this on their own without using React built-in features. So first, I have this app component again, and we have this form component inside of it. And for the form component, we have this form component. We have an h4 for the form, input, and when you focus the input, it will call handle focus, and it will log you focus me. Okay? And then we have this button, so that when you click the button, it will do a console.log trying my best to focus. Okay? So very basic. So refresh the page, focus here, you focus me, click focus the input, try my best to focus. Why? Because it wasn't able to focus the input element actually. Right? So using vanilla JS, let's do set timeout in here. So the reason why I'm using set timeout is because when this code will be executed, there will be a chance that this UI in here will not be rendered in the DOM yet. Why? Because this will be executed before this component or these elements will be rendered to the DOM. That's why I'll be using set timeout. Just maybe 1 second. Okay? And what we will do is, for vanilla JS, document.querySelector, we can use input because we only have one input element in here anyways. And we can do focus. Okay? Let's refresh the page. 1. Alright, as you can see, we have been able to focus the element and it logs you focus me. Right? How about writing data into it? Okay? So what we can do is, we can do that value equals to form component. So there's an error. Okay, because it can actually be undefined in here. So what we can do is, we can change this question mark to exclamation point. Meaning, we are assuring TypeScript that this will not result to null. That's why when we access that value, it will always have a value. Okay? So save it, refresh the page again, and there you have it. We have form component written in our input element, right? So, how can we read the value? Okay? So, we can do console.log and then pass it here using that value. Okay? Same thing, right? So, refresh the page, form component, and we have form component in here. Okay? So, that's how you will do it in vanilla JS or using just JavaScript without React. So, how are you going to do this? Using useRef hook. Okay? So, let's remove this. And now, what we will do is, we will create const input element equals to useRef. Okay? And then, let's import this useRef from React. And then, pass this input element as a ref of this input. So, that's how you're going to do it. You will be passing this useRef, the value of this, as a ref to the input. So, ref is actually an attribute for ReactJS components. This is a property that you can use to add reference to an element. Okay? Or to a component, actually. So, either element or component. Okay? So, in here, there's just an error. It's not assignable to type, okay? Because we haven't assigned a type for our input element. So, it's going to be HTML input element. Okay? Still, there's an error. Let's check it out. HTML input element undefined, not assignable to type HTML input element null. Okay. So, meaning, what this means is, this ref can either be null or HTML input element. But in here, it can be either HTML input element or undefined. Okay? So, in here, we will just do null as an initial value. Save it. So, there's no more errors, right? So, now, how can we focus on this element, right? So, when we click this button, we will be able to focus on this. Okay? So, on the handle click, let's do input element .current.focus. Okay? Save it, refresh the page, click focus the input. We were able to focus on the element, on the input element, and we have this log, trying my best to focus, and you focus me. Okay? Next is, how about writing data into this? Okay? So in here, let's change this to, for example, value. Maybe let's focus and then let's add another one. So value, then we will equals to handle click. Okay? So again, this question mark, meaning this can be undefined, and if it's not undefined, then it will call focus. Okay? And in here, if it's undefined, then it will not call the value. But the problem is we're assigning value into it. Okay? So what we can do to fix this is we can just add if input element that current and pass it inside of this. Okay? Remove question mark, and there you go. Meaning, if we have value on the dot current, then we can do all of this. Okay? Without TypeScript blocking us or throwing an error. Save it. Refresh the page. Click focus the input. As you can see, we were able to focus and we were able to add values in here. We can also read values. Okay? So, console.log value like this. Save it. Click value handle click. Okay? So that's how you can reference an element using useRef hook. Okay? So one more thing is, as you can see, we didn't add any value properties to an input element in here, right? Meaning, this is an uncontrolled component or element. So, instead of making this input as controlled component using useState hook, you can just make this as an uncontrolled and you can still read the data inside this input element by using reps. Remember that controlled component using useState always trigger a re-render every time you change the value. Sometimes, you definitely want to do that, but if your goal is just to write something in the input element like this and read it after without triggering a re-render, then use useRef hook. So you don't need to trigger a re-render and it will not affect the performance of your component. Okay? Also again, one important thing to take note is this input element right here. When we assign this as a ref of the input element, this input element that current, this one, will only have a value once this input element has been rendered in the DOM, in here. Okay? Because that's the only time that the input element can actually pass the reference to your input element variable. Okay? That's why if you do console.log and then input element that current, save it, refresh the page, as you can see, this is null. Right? Why? Because initially, it is null. It will only have a value once the input has been rendered to the DOM and it passes the reference to the input element. That's why, since this is now rendered to the DOM, when we click focus the input button, since it is rendered to the DOM, then we can now access the reference of this input element. So clicking it, that's why we were able to focus, add value, and read value from it. Okay? And again, as you can see, these nulls here were not re-rendered because changing the value of useRef doesn't trigger a re-render. Okay? Something to take note and make sure that you remember that. So that's actually it on how you can select or reference an element and manipulate it whatever you want. And remember, doing this or accessing or changing the value of your input element that current or ref doesn't trigger a re-render. Okay? So that's the difference of it with useState hook. I hope you like this lecture and I'll see you on the next one. So now I want to show you a different way to attach your ref to your component using what we called callback refs. Okay? So in our application, again, in our app component, we have this h1 callback refs and an input element. Okay? Very easy. So now, what we want to do is, we want to attach a ref to this input element. Okay? So to use callback refs, Basically, we will be creating a function. First, a variable to assign our ref. So input callback ref. So this will be HTML input element, or can be null, right? Equals to null. Okay, and then we will be creating our function. So const set input element equals to element, which is type HTML input element or null. So pass it here like this, and then we can do input callback ref equals to element. Okay, and then pass this function to our ref. Okay, so we actually pass a callback function to our ref. So what will happen is ref will be calling this function, pass the element, which is this input element, once it is rendered to the DOM, and we can now assign it to our input callback ref. Okay, let's just add a console.log in here. So element like this. Save it. So when we refresh the page, as you can see, it actually logs the input element, and when you hover on this, it is actually referring to this one, right? This input element has been passed to our function, and we can now pass this to our variable. So that's how callback ref works. Okay? So with this, we can actually do a focus event. Okay? So that when our input component has been rendered in the DOM, we can actually focus right away on it. So in here, we can do if input callback ref exists, so it has values, we can do dot focus. Save it, refresh the page, clear this. As you can see, it automatically focused the input element. Okay, so that's one of the benefits of using callback ref. But again, there's a different way on how you can do this, and we will discuss that later in this course when we start discussing use effects. Okay? But another thing that I want to show you for callback refs is how about when we update or render our component. Okay? Let me just create a counter again. Const counter state set counter equals to use state. Initial value is 0. And let's just create a button, increment counter, create a function, const handle button click, set counter plus 1, just so we can trigger a render for our component, because I want to show you what will happen to this set input element. On click, pass the handle button click, save it, refresh the page. So element input, clear this, increment counter, oops, wrong spelling, where is it? Increment, save it. Okay, sorry about that. Clear this, click increment counter, refresh this again, click increment counter. So as you can see, our element, so this element that is being passed on the set input element function is actually null, and then it becomes the input element again. So why? Because when you render, there will be a chance that this input element is actually different from the previous render. That's why what React does is, it will pass the null first in the set input element, so you can remove the reference, and then it will pass again the input element when it has been rendered to the DOM again, or when your component is done re-rendering, just to make sure that you are referencing the latest or current element that is rendered in the DOM. Okay? So remember, when you render or update your component, React will pass null first and then pass the correct input element. Okay? And the good thing with that is, since we are checking if input callback ref has values, we can then focus again on the element or in the input element. So if we refresh the page and then click anywhere to remove the focus on the element or the input element, increment counter, and we are focused again to our input element. So that's one of the benefits of using callback ref. Okay? So that's actually it. I hope you like it, and I'll see you on the next one. So now, it is time to learn how to pass refs to a component. This is indeed a must-learn topic so that in the future, if ever you create your own UI library, you will definitely want to allow the consumers of your library to be able to pass refs so they can reference the element inside your component. So, how can we do that? So in here in our application, I have this app component again. And as you can see, we have H3, forwarding refs, this one, and we have a reusable input component. Okay, so for this input component, if we check this one, very simple. So we just have an input inside of it. So now, how can we reference this input element inside the input component to our app component so that when we load our page, we can focus on it? Okay, so first, we will be creating our cons. Input ref equals to useRef. Okay, same thing. And then, we'll pass the ref in here. Input ref. Okay, so now, how can this component know what to do with this ref? Okay, because it doesn't know what to do for this, right? So, what we can do here is, we will be using ReactForwardRef. Okay, so, this component in here, this functional component, we will just wrap it up to ReactForwardRef and then pass it inside in here. Of course, we need to import React. Import it, okay? And then for the types, so if you check this one, the first generic is actually, where is it? This one. So the first generic is actually the ref value, okay? And the second one is the props, alright? So in here, what we will do is, we will add HTML input element, alright? So the second generic is actually optional, but we can also pass it so you can see how we can do it. So interface input. So I input props. So like this, and then maybe we can pass an onClick. All right, which is optional. Okay, let's just make this optional. So assign it as the second parameter in here. Okay, our second generic. Alright, let me just put it down. So, like this. So, now, we can have the props as the first parameter, and the second one is the ref. Okay, so for the props, we have onClick. So, pass the onClick in here, and pass the ref as well in here. Okay, save it, and now in here, so we need to add a type for this. Also, we need to import this one. Like this, there's an error because it should be HTML input element. Okay, so let's pass it here. HTML input element, and we will passing null. Okay, save it. So there's no more error. So now we need to select or focus on this input. Okay, so how can we do that? So let's create a button again. So in here, focus input, and then let's create cons handle button click. We will focus again. So input ref. So if input ref dot current, we will do focus. Okay, save it, and then pass the onClick event or the onClick function in here, the onClick event of the button. Save it, refresh the page. Click focus input, and yeah, we were able to focus on the input. Okay, so that's how you can pass a ref to a component. So we can actually reference the input inside of it. Like for example, in our input component. And this is the types. So remember this. The first one is the value of the ref, and the second one is the value of the props. And for the functional component, the first parameter is actually the props, and the second one is the ref when using React.ForwardRef. Okay, so that's how you can forward this reference to an input element inside your input component. Okay, Next example is, so I have this myForm component. Let's just import it here. So let's remove this. Let's remove this. Okay. And then let's add myForm component. Okay. So it's named myForm component. Save it. So in here. So now I will teach you how you can pass the refs to a component in a different way. Because what if we want to reference both input and the button, right? So we don't just want to reference one element or one component inside this myForm, but we want to reference both of them. Okay? So how can we do that? So first, we will be creating useRef again. So cons input element equals to useRef. So you already know this. So HTML input element null. Same with the button. So copy this button element and HTML button element. Okay? And then in myForm, what we will do is we will be creating props. myForm props. So you can either add I in here. It actually depends on your project and in your team on what will be the convention to use. Okay? So in here, we can have input ref and we can have button ref. Okay? So what's the type for the input ref, right? So if we check this, we can use this actually. Pass it here. And same thing with the button element, of course. Just copy it. Save it. Okay? And then in the myForm, so what we can do is, we can pass, oops, let's also add it here. React.fc. Save it. Input ref. Of course, this will be optional, right? So it's actually up to the consumer of this component if they want to pass some refs or not. So like this, input ref, input element, and then button ref, button element. Save it. For the sake of simplicity, let's just use set timeout. Okay? Set timeout like this. 1000. So later in this course, we will learn how to do this the React way. But for now, let's just use set timeout. Okay? So button element dot current dot click. So let's do it like this. And click. Okay, if we click this button inside the myForm, it should log myForm button. And we will also focus on the element, input element dot current. Okay, actually you can just do it like this using question mark. Okay, dot focus. Save it, refresh the page. Oops, nothing happens actually because we haven't passed input ref yet. Okay, my bad on that. So ref, input ref, right? Like this, input ref, and then button ref. Okay, and then ref in here. Alright, save it. We should be good to go. Refresh the page. And I was able to click the button, myForm button, and I was able to focus the input element. Right? So that's the other way on how you can pass the refs to your component. So maybe you're wondering when to use ref versus a custom ref props. So these are a custom ref props because it is not the default built-in ref props of React. The default one is this, using React.forwardRef. So when should we use the other one compared to the other? Okay? Well, if you need more flexibility, like for example, this myForm component wherein it contains multiple elements that we want to reference, then go for the custom ref props. But if you are just going to use it to a component wherein it is easy to understand that when you pass a ref to that component, you are referring to a specific element of that component. Like for example, this input component. because we know that this input component is actually a reusable input for our application, and when we pass a ref on this, we know that we should be referencing this input element inside of it, right? So it is actually very straightforward to understand on how the ref of this component will be used, right? So you can definitely use either of the two, and there's nothing wrong with that. Okay? One outstanding difference though is when using TypeScript. As you can see, we have added ref props in here in the myForm component, right? So we have these props declared as the props of myForm component. But for the other one, the interface for the props is pure and only pertains to the props that it needs aside from refs. So as you can see in here, these props interface are actually pure. It doesn't have the refs props. And that's the benefit of it. Why? Because there will be a chance that when you want to export this interface to other files or to other components, then you don't want the ref props. You only want what's the props that you can pass to your input element. Okay? So there will be cases like that, and that's the good thing with this. So that's actually it for forwarding refs to a component. But one thing to take note is do not overuse refs. Why? You should only use refs if you cannot express something as a props. Like for example, scrolling to a node, focusing a node like what we did here, triggering an animation, selecting text, and so on and so forth. But if you just need to add a default value, for example, to an input component, so instead of doing input element that current that value equals to default, to set the default value of your input element, don't do this. Well, you can just use default value props like this. Default value. Okay? This way, it is actually easier to understand how the value was written to the input component. Right? So, I hope you like this lecture about forwarding refs. I know you do, and I'll see you on the next one. So now, let's explore use effects. So, in my app again, I have this app component that contains my app component inside of it. And in here, in my app component, I have this use state for the counter again. And I have this input element showing in the UI, the value of the counter, and the button to increment the counter. Okay? So, our UI looks like this. If I click increment counter, it will increase, of course. Right? So now, what I want to do is, I want to focus on this input element upon reloading the page. Okay? When the page loads, I want to focus right away on this input element. So, how can I do that? So, we will be using use effect hooks. Okay? Before that, let me just remove this strict mode in here. So, to avoid confusion on how it works. Later, we will talk about how strict mode affects use effect hook. So, now, in here, let's create use effect. Okay? So, this actually accepts two parameters. The first one is the function. So, this is actually the side effect. And the second one is actually the dependency. Later, we will talk about dependencies, and let's just work on the first parameter, which is the side effect that we want to implement. Okay? Again, this function in here will be executed once the component has been rendered in the DOM. Okay? So, to focus on this input element, I will be creating const input ref equals useRef HTML input element null. Okay? And then pass the ref in here and focus in here. Okay. So to prove that this value in here will always have a value when we run use effect, I'll be removing this question mark to become exclamation point. Okay? So exclamation point means that this value in here will always have a value. Okay? So save it, refresh the page. As you can see, we focus right away on the input element. Let me just add a logging. So console.log use effect triggered. Save it. Refresh the page again. So it works, right? If I click outside and if I click increment counter, it focuses again. Why? Because that's how dependencies work. It actually checks on how often you want to execute the side effect in every render. Okay? So if you don't pass anything, this will always be executed in every render. But if you only want to execute it once, then you can pass an empty array, meaning there are no dependencies on this, and this will be executed only once. Okay? So if I refresh the page again, focus in here, click outside, increment counter, it doesn't focus again, and we don't have any lag in here. Right? But what if I pass counter? Save it, refresh the page, click outside, click increment counter, it focus again. Why? Because the counter value is changing in every render. How about set counter? So as we know, set counter doesn't change in every render. So the value of this is the same in every render. Okay? So if we save it, refresh the page, click outside, increment counter, it doesn't focus again. Why? Because this is the same thing in every render. How about adding multiple? Okay? Multiple dependencies. Refresh the page in here, click outside, increment counter, it focuses again in every render. Why? Because either of the dependencies in here changes, it will trigger the effect in here. Okay? So that's how use effect works with dependencies on it, right? So now, what if I actually want to add an event listener on the click event? Okay, so let me just remove the set counter, leave counter in here. And in here, let's do window.add event listener and on the click event. And what we want to do is, we will just log something. So console.log click triggered. Okay, save it. So refresh the page, clear this. When I click outside, so I was able to add a side effect by attaching a listener on the click event in any place in here, right? But what I want to show you is, what if we click increment counter? Okay? So like this. And we click outside again, so clear this. So the click triggered has been logged twice. Okay? And that's actually a problem. Why? Because what we want is, we only want to listen to the click event once and log the click triggered once. So how do we fix it? Of course, you can actually use it by doing this so that this will only be executed once, right? So if we refresh the page and click outside, 910, click increment counter, and then clear this, and then click outside again. So it only logs once, right? So by using the empty array, so it will only execute the effect once. But what I want to show you, this use effect function in here, this side effect, can actually return a function. Like this. So this can actually return a function. So the main use of this function is to clean up whatever side effects that you have added in here. Okay? So if ever you have added a side effect that should be cleaned in every render, then you can actually use this function in here. Just return a function on your side effect inside use effect hook. So what I want to do here is, I want to remove the event listener like this, so that I can only have one listener in my page. Okay? But before that, let me just create a function, const handle click, so we can turn off the event nicely in here, like this. So handle click and handle click. Okay, save it. Alright, it should be good. So let's just add a logging in here, console.log. Let's say cleanup. Oops, I forgot to add the counter in our dependencies. Okay, so like this, save it. Okay, refresh the page. So use effect triggered, clear this, click increment counter. As you can see, we have triggered the cleanup function first, this one, before we triggered the effect. Okay, so what happened? When your component re-renders, it will call first this cleanup function, and then it will now call this side effect again. And again, if your component re-renders, it will call first this cleanup function. So that's how it works. That's why if you click outside, it will only log one click triggered. Right? If you remove the cleanup, save it, refresh the page, increment counter, it will log twice. But if we have the cleanup, again, refresh the page, increment counter, and then click outside, it will only log once. Okay? With that, we don't have double subscription to the click event because we were able to clean it by returning a function to our useEffect side effect function. Okay? And one more thing that I want to show you is, so in here, in my app component, we will be using users component. Okay? So now, what I want to show you is, we will be fetching users from an API. Okay? Before that, in my users, so in here, in my users component, I have this users. So I user, and a header h3 users, and showing all the users that I have in an unordered list. Okay? So if we check our UI, it actually looks like this. It feels empty, right? Because it's actually empty. So I have this fake API in here. So I have this function in here to get the users. So get users, and I just have this as an async function. So it will be like an API. It's like we're calling an API. And then I'm just waiting for 1 second. So this function, this is how you can wait for 1 second. And then return the users. So users from here. So I have this 8 users prepared for this fake API. Okay? So now, what we will do is, we will load all the users in here. Okay? So how are we going to do that? First, we will call useEffect. Okay? Import this. And pass the function here. And I only want to execute this once because I only want to load the users once in this UI. No need to load it again in every render. Okay? So like this. And then, let's just call get users. This fake API in here. So this one, this get users function. So now, with this get users API, so what we can do is, we can do a .then, and then users, and then set users. Okay? So when this is done executing, we will just assign the users using the set users. Okay? And in here, maybe we want to show a loading while waiting for the users to arrive. So what we can do in here is users. Let's just change this to a code. So in here, users.length. So if there are length on our users, we will render this. We can just do it like this and like this. So if we don't have users yet, we will have a loading UI. So let's just make it simple. H5 loading. Save it. Refresh the page. Loading. And we were able to show our users. Okay? So that's actually it. You can also use useEffect to fetch users from an API. And then, after you're done fetching it, you can now assign it to a state, like in here, the user state, so that it will trigger a render and show the data in your UI or in your component. You can also add a loading, of course, while waiting for the data to arrive. Okay? So again, useEffect, the first parameter, if we go back to my app, in here, so the first parameter again is the side effect. You can return a function in here to clean up the side effect. Okay? And the second parameter is the dependencies. So you can add multiple dependencies in here, but remember that either of the dependencies changes, it will execute this in every render. Okay? This function right here will be executed in every render. Okay? Before we end, I want to add strict mode again. Save it. Refresh the page. So in here, if we clean this up, refresh the page, as you can see, we have this use effect triggered, and we have cleanup and use effect triggered. So what happened? So what strict mode does is, it will actually trigger a render to your component to make sure that your component is actually doing what it needs to do. So in here, for example, we have this use effect triggered, and we have called cleanup. Why? Because our component actually triggers a render using strict mode, and it triggers use effect triggered again. Okay? So with this, you can actually assure that your component is still working as expected. Like for example, if we don't have a cleanup in here, like this, save it, and then refresh the page, and if we click in here, as you can see, it double logs the click triggered, which we can see that it is actually wrong right away, right? Without even clicking the increment counter to update the state. Okay? So with this, we have found the issue right away. Okay? So of course, we should bring back cleanup, save it, refresh the page, click outside, and it should only log once per click. Okay? So that's actually it for UseFX. I hope you like this lecture, and I'll see you on the next one. Hey there! This course is about learning React version 18. But this is not just a simple tutorial. We will deep dive into each features that the library can offer so we can have a wider understanding how they work. We will also use TypeScript together with React, so we will have a code base that is super easy to understand. So in this course, we will learn all the JavaScript skills necessary for us to easily learn ReactJS, creating React components the right way, the life cycles of a component, and also we will learn React hooks to make your component do whatever you want it to do. And as I have mentioned, we will be doing everything in TypeScript, so you can also learn it at the same time. What's going to happen if you use strict mode in React? What's the benefit of it? How does it affect the hooks that we are going to use? We will also talk about reflow and repaint, so we can understand how the user interface that you are seeing in your screen is being painted in the browser. How does it really works? After learning this, you will know the difference between use effect, use layout effect, and use insertion effect. We will also talk about how to optimize our components. Very helpful if you have a huge application like Facebook, so your web page will run very fast. We will talk about render and commit phase in React. This will help you understand how React works in the background and the process it does just to show the component you want to render in the DOM. Do you know that React categorizes updates if it's high or low priority? We will learn that here so you can determine for yourself which is which. We will also learn the core algorithm that React uses, which is called React Fiber or Fiber Reconciler or Fiber Architecture. This is what React uses so that it can prioritize updates and determine what changes should be committed to the DOM. You can also suspend a component while waiting for an asynchronous resource. Very helpful so you can show things like a loading UI. You will also learn how to profile your components so you can determine how much time it takes for React to render them. Very helpful so you can pinpoint which slows down your web application. So, we will learn all of these and a lot more in this course. So, This is actually a deep dive of React 18 library and React itself, so you will have a better understanding how everything works. Zero knowledge on React is needed and discussions are beginner friendly. I hope you're excited. Let's get into it.